I'm very glad that we are able to discuss some of the issues regarding the question when, why, and how to document war experiences, which came up during the workshop day today at German Historical Institute in Warsaw. And I'm also very glad that Anna Wylegała is with me. She works at the Institute of Sociology at the Polish Academy of Science. Mechtel Dwenken from the University of Luxembourg, Natalia Aleksiun from the University of Florida, and Sofia Dyak from the Lviv Center of Urban History. And all of them have a very rich background of working themselves with historical material concerning World War II. And at the same time, they are very much concerned with the question how we react as scholars to the situation today in Ukraine, being based in very different spots. So looking from Ukraine, from Western Ukraine, from Luxembourg, Poland, and also traveling around Europe in the case of Natalia Aleksiun. And what we will try to do is, on the one hand, to go back and to look into historical experiences of documenting war experiences in the 20th century, and then to look at the ongoing attempt to do this today in 2022, facing an ongoing war. And I really look forward to a very short introduction by Natalia Aleksiun. She recently came up with a book on called Conscious History, covering the pre-war experiences of Jewish Polish historians before the Holocaust. So not looking at them not in the shadow of the Holocaust, but I wanted to ask you for the beginning to give you account of Polish Jewish survivors doing archival emergency archival work, as we called it today, during the war, still being on survivors, and how this work looked for them actually.
And thank you so much for including me in this conversation. So I think that the emergency very much applies to that experience. And in a way, when Felix, you said survivors documenting as the Holocaust was happening, right? They were not necessarily survivors. In fact, a lot of the documenting was done by people who ended up not surviving, and much of it was driven with the understanding that whatever their personal fate will be, that the documentation should stay behind. And the best known case, of course, is the case of Warsaw Ghetto and Onek Shabbat archives of Emanuel Ringelblum. But really, the more we know about social history of individual ghettos, this kind of grassroots initiative is present everywhere. It's just a question of how much of this effort managed to become materialized, how much of the material survived. And one of the big questions is Lviv, right? Lviv had also that kind of communal underground archive initiative that did not fully materialize and didn't survive. Now, once we get across that huge divide of in the Holocaust and in their aftermath, then it's based on a sense of continued emergency, on continued moral, ethical urgency, of continued communal necessity for that kind of record for history, for future generations. And interestingly, I think, and we will probably go into these questions, as much as for within sort of the internal Jewish consumption of how the community coming out of the ashes, as it were, how it needs to document what happened to individuals, to families, communities, institutions, but also beyond. This was a record that was supposed to be read and heard outside of Poland, outside of Polish Jewry. And then we, of course, have a question of language. What do you do when language may become a barrier for that kind of universal reception, and what kinds of questions do you ask both with that universal addressee and with sort of internal addressee. But the sense of emergency continues, and also what I find particularly interesting, and I don't want to go over time, so just wave at me. What I find particularly interesting is this interplay between scripting and grassroots, creating it as they went, right? So on the one hand, there are questionnaires published very early on how to interview survivors, what questions to ask, where to in particular get the record. And of course, it's also political. So, right. So it's important to get a record of resistance because we want to know all kinds of ways in which Jews resisted, but also to get a record of difficult parts such as collaboration, neighbors' position, etc. But if we look at the testimonies that the Central Jewish Historical Commission collected in 1944, actually already, but 1945, 1946, and we look at the discussions in the protocols of the commission and the questionnaires published, it's not like the material actually fits perfectly what was envisioned. And there was a great deal of freedom in how people shaped their records. And there are those testimonies that are incredibly personal, incredibly intimate, seem to be completely unshaped by any sense of a taboo. Right, talking about sexual violence, talking about collaboration, sort of surprisingly, actually. And then there are those very generic, general historical articles, right, written in collective voice. And I'm very interested in what do we make of this great variety of material that is shaped not just by the vision of people who have that professional sense that we need a historical record, also for future trials, but also how individuals saw and understood what is important to be said. And then, of course, there is a question of those who took notes, right? There is always the intermediary between us, the readers of these documents, and the survivors. But I will just stop here.
Listen to you for much longer. It's not only the case that still during the Holocaust, it was not clear who will survive, but also it was not, it came up today in a discussion that also in summer 1944, when Shimon Datner started to collect actually testimonies and to write them down, nobody knew how long the war would take. And I think that's something very similar today, that we don't know how long it will take to look at it as history.
Can I add one sentence? So for me, one of the most incredible moments of this fragility of those testimonies is a testimony of taken in Lublin by a survivor of Bełżec, who comes, one of very few, who comes, gives a testimony, gets to a certain point, and is supposed to come on the next day or next week, and he's murdered in between. So what we get is kind of mid-sentence record of his survival and the camp specifically.
I think that going back to 1944 or 1943 makes sense, not only because it was the last major war in this particularly part of Europe, but also because people who lived there had to come to terms with the results of the war. And that's something Anna Wilegała did, has been doing research really for a long time right now. And she's specialized very much in oral history, and did a quite long and intense project on the aftermath of violence and the Holocaust, also the Holocaust in nowadays Western Ukraine, looking into something she calls a social anthropology of void. And I wanted to ask you, like, with this particularly background of taking interviews and working with people who sometimes moved into the Städtlach where Jews who lived before, sometimes in Polish Ukrainian communities. How does this experience shapes your own perception of what is going on, and how is your response to this?
It's working. Yeah, I was thinking, what can I contribute to this discussion? And I thought that maybe indeed this experience of mine of being a person who conducted like hundreds of interviews with not survivors of the Second World War, but of people who went through this war and went through the resettlement and being refugee themselves and so on, how it can be used to understand what we are going to do now in terms of documenting this war. And I think that, well, what I see as a scholar doing this research on the war that ended long time ago is that this emergency archiving is very specific, exactly in terms of the distance, of the time distance, because all these people that I've interviewed so far, Poles and Ukrainians, they were talking about events that happened 80, 70, sometimes 90 years ago, right? So they had this time distance. And of course, it didn't mean there was no trauma involved, because trauma can appear in the interviews conducted many, many years after whatever happened. But it gave us some safety, both us as researchers and them as interviewees. And this safety is gone now because there's no safety. I mean, the safety in Europe is gone, but also the safety within this research is not present. And this is, I think, one of the most important challenges we need to face as researchers doing research on the ongoing war, on the something that is not solved yet, not wrapped up, not ended. And one of the most important challenges is to take care of the interviewees and of us. And I also thought that, and this is how we are going to document and when, now, but also there's this question of why the interviews that we are conducting and as researchers with people who survived or who went through the Second World War, they are research oriented. We have some research questions. I mean, I had this project on the void and I wanted to get to know what happens when some certain strata of the population is gone. But our goal here is quite different. I mean, we might approach these interviews with people who are experiencing the war in Ukraine later as researchers, but I think that what's important now is just to collect the stories. And it was said at some point here today that we need to leave behind our personal interests as researchers for a while. We might come back, and I might come back to these interviews as person willing to compare the narratives of the survivors of these two wars, but it's not time for this now. Now we simply need to focus on doing it well, quickly and as ethically and safety as possible. So shortly.
For sharing these reflections, I wanted to hand over directly to Sofia Dyak, partly because she's not only the director of the Lviv Center for Urban History, but also she has this background in doing research in how people cope with the actual outcome of war in Wrocław, former Breslau, and Lviv, and you wrote this Histoire croisée, trying to bring these two different experiences together. How did this play out for you, being in Lviv in February 2022? I read on the internet your interview where you said that many thoughts of about September 1939 came to your mind. And so how did this professional background play into your perception of the actual historical moment? But then how was your reaction as part of this community, and how did you start to actually document the ongoing war?
Yeah, we do have many hats and many experiences. I would probably begin with this, one of my angles as an individual researcher. It's with this, now I've been working on the post-war, whatever it means. It does not necessarily mean the signing of the final peace treaty. Like the way out of war begins in different places in different times. It's very individual, and for some people it never ends. I think that telling stories of war is a crucial part of getting out of war eventually, and we do hope. While you also from not only mine, but I think for many people who researched or taught history of war, the last big war, Second World War, it's that the war is kind of never over. It is formally can become there's an active fighting, but in terms of trauma experiences, memory, change life, change societies. It's never over, and I think this is also. But so then I was working on post-war Lviv and post-war Wrocław. I came to see how I'm actually missing voices, and I was looking. I was working mainly with documents, and if you think about what archive has. It does have documents, it does have some individual experiences, but I've seen that, how in Wrocław for the post-war, eventually with, I will not go in details, there became more of the individual testimonies, partly produced or provoked by state, but there were these individual stories of people written. And then there were also this general culture, however, it was limited, of writing pamiętniki. And in Działrenko Pisu, in the manuscript, this holding of a Solineum, you could find unpublished, some were many published. And actually I say that how in Lviv, for many new inhabitants of the city, you can find information about, but very rarely information and voices from. I think that the closest you get, or I've got, are actually inquiries to get permission to get to Lviv after the war, and when somebody was rather in weak position, tend to describe his or her story, including the story of war experience as a part of what, of the part of arguing what is needed. But that actually this displacement and the sense that how we miss voices in history is also how would be what is the history of war that will be written, because it depends on types of sources you have. You will never have all sources. You will always, we as a historian are aware that there are voices we don't reach, we don't get. I mean, keeping this awareness that there are experiences which are there, but you can't really support them with the quotation in the archive is important part of thinking about the past. And I think it's also some of the awareness that came to me as we in Lviv with the colleagues were doing public history projects, how you actually are becoming aware that, there are those whom we hear and those whom we don't. And I think that, you know, this is what Anya was referring, that, you know, that this war and post-war experiences as individual and not state produced, because we do have, for example, Commission for Investigating Nazi Fascist Crimes long, like from 43, we do have post-war criminal cases where you would find voices from the, but these are not necessarily willful testimonies of life stories. I mean, later they are like memory in the 90s, and there are initiatives that we're collecting, but for about emergency. And here at the center, we do have more of an institutional experience of collecting testimonies, interviews at Maidan, with the experience of how you would, you know, how you act without distance, not only as those whom you talk, but you do not, I mean, what is your distance as those who is interviewed, who is an interviewer, and how we manage this different role of both an expert voice, but also a witness and somebody who is experiencing, and how you and how that does influence your choice, you know. And to conclude, I think that this is a part of this event, and we do hope to plan to have more of public discussions, or even like lectures with this title, Source as a Choice. And it is a good I think it might be useful metaphor to think, you know, how source as such is a multiple choices made across different time. You know, somebody creating a template or a format, asking somebody, then somebody is, you know, preserving or not, and then somebody archiving or not, and then revisiting and interpreting it. So it's like a source as multiple choices. And right now we are making our choices and also bearing a responsibility for that.
Thank you so much. So actually we are not discussing the history of the war, but the future of the history, and making our choices today. That's a very important point. I would like to hand over to Martel Venken, who is a professor at the Center of Contemporary and Digital History at the University of Luxembourg, with a very strong background in borderland studies, and also working in a very specific configuration now. And how is your perception being now located really in the rest of Europe, with refugees arriving, not in so large numbers as in Poland, but still arriving? How is your take on this as somebody working intensively on digital history now in this Luxembourg configuration?
Thank you. So my first book was on migration history, and I looked specifically at a group of Ukrainian female forced laborers who worked in Germany during the Second World War, and then after the war traveled to Belgium and there married Belgian citizens. And I looked at the way how they were giving meaning to their war experiences in a context that was not familiar with their war experiences as such. And what I learned from the oral history interviews I could still do when these women were very old, I learned two things that are relevant for today. One of it is that for a long time they had the feeling that they were not being heard, that they were just ending up in a context that was so foreign from where they were coming from. And I think by making it possible now, creating a structure in which this space can be given to them, at least we're trying to do that, like that they can be heard, and that we have sources that document it right now. Another element I came across during my research when I was trying to compare policies, like migration policies, naturalization policies, and then the practices of people, is that when you do this interview so many years after the events, the dates are just being very, very vague. So I wanted to know whether it was before or after 1956 when they had this discussion with Belgian administration, because it was the thaw and this was important, but whether this was 1954 or 1957, they had no idea. So for in a way, you could say the argument could be, well, we are now closer to the event, so maybe we receive more accurate data. But it's an open question, because you have other research results that show exactly the opposite. Look at the work of Joanna Michlitz, for example, on like testimonies of children during the Holocaust who were hidden. And so the interviews who were done just after the war is about this room in which they were hidden, and the way they understood the war from sitting in that room. Whereas later on, when the same person, when then was already grown up, was interviewed again, that heard from parents why they were sitting in this room, and the context was just much bigger, and you receive another testimony about the same situation that is maybe more accurate in certain aspects or not. So it's an argument that is going to look differently for different people at different moments, I think. Now so the second book is about the history of borderlands, and then I also ended up to live in the borderlands. It's very much about this, like you have the border makes an inclusion and an exclusion of different groups of people. And when you're living in such a borderlands where there are a lot of borders, you have this overlapping of such exclusive measures. And that is what you already see right now with Ukrainian refugees arriving in Luxembourg, that the policy measures that are put in place in order to offer them what is called in this policy language temporary protection as refugees cannot possibly match with the practices people have in these borderlands, where they are very, very mobile, but not everybody can be mobile in the same way, because refugees need to be in the state where they receive refugee status, and Luxembourg is very small. So this because in my book I speak a lot about practices and experiences of borderland inhabitants. This is also something that I take with me in my head when I'm now designing this kind of like research framework for these interviews. So in a way, Anna, it does influence my research background does influence the way I'm perceiving this project, but I hope well, it's to the benefit of it.
I would add more like a research question: the impact of people who faced war and violence gave testimony, how this practice of narrativization had an impact on their further life, in a sense, how it pre-structured the way how they told their story later on, and also the possible available narratives of the later generations. But I wanted to come back to Sofia and ask you more in detail, how was the response of the center? And you did, if I understood properly, you did not ask this question when and why. You just started to document in various ways, and maybe you could just briefly give us a picture of how your work looked like already in March and April.
No, I can't recall the date, but I do recall a setting, and it was into the first week after the Thursday, which the morning then so many things changed, and there were and still are air raid alarms, and we went with colleagues to our basement, and my colleague Taras Nazaruk was sitting, and Oles Machanec was sitting on another chair, and just pulled and then said, look, we actually, we have to talk, let's talk about documenting, let's, because the first thing that we did, it was about first several days was where we are, where our dear ones and family, and what do you do? I mean, do you have enough of pills in case you need some pills, and so on, this type of questions. And, that's definitely something that was in Lviv. I mean, in a different city, it's a different set, it's and it's also very individual. And then there was a decision to set up shelter. And then, so what we document is just basically very openly thinking, okay, what we have, and we did have an existing preset. So we are not in a tabula rasa situation. So we did have visual archive of images. So we thought about visual. Then we thought, okay, so what is with digital? Something like websites, so what is going on? And, one of the first one also was with testimonies. And this was the last one that was put into realization. The first one was with visual, and that was really challenging because you cannot take images. And in first 2 weeks, that was really much more strict in general. And people were thinking, that's in Lviv, that, then you go and just take images. And if you do not have a press, and that actually puts a question what press is making photo of, so because press and journalists and photojournalists have a particular angle. I think everybody has a particular angle. And but then we were thinking, what can we document that maybe press is not catching? So this is probably away from epicenters, because epicenter of events, and for example, in Lviv, that was a railway station with many refugees, but all about things which are not sites, which are not central. And then we were asking people who were journalists or photographers with journalistic, like targeting them, asking them this and this and that, and in other cities. And then also asking people to share, because images of war are really can be very different from a destroyed house and a blast and so on, but to really peacefully looking interior, and a comment to this interior can actually make it a war image. And Telegram was another direction. It's one of the main communication and information spreading media. And some of the Telegram channels do not exist anymore, of those that we documented. Some do exist. So that's another one. And oral history and oral testimonies, this is something that took the longest and is, each has its challenges, but this one we can discuss a bit. And another is about we're also asking people those who write or draw or in other way diaries. So this is also, it's a little bit in a tradition of asking, and this asking also sometimes make people maybe aware of this possibility of that you could do that. And recording dreams, which is might be a bit unusual, but is actually a historic one if you think about but if you think about dreams in Third Reich book, and then if you think about dreams as a source for Holocaust studies by Barbara Engelking article. So yeah, that's actually generally what is source, and who and how and why takes them. They are very different. The important thing is that they capture diverse experiences, while each of them and being incomplete at the same time.
We already asked the question, we answered the question when, because basically you argued that it's now, and that's what is already ongoing on. For me today, it was important that it is not just the Lviv Center of Urban History doing this, but a multitude of initiatives all over the country. And they all have in common that they are part of the civil society, and this is something, a bottom-up process, basically doing something because people see a need. We had various examples also covered today from Kiev and other places, and I wanted to ask Anna and Mechthild what happens if you take this urgent need to document, or this, I mean, what is clear in Ukrainian context, that people do not ask for permission, but they just do it because it's a way to cope with the ongoing war, and it's a way to get agency yourself, but also to give voice to the people who give the testimony. And what happens if you take this idea to another country alongside with the refugee stream, with the people who had to flee actually Ukraine and who are not sure when they can go back, where they will go further, and are kind of stuck, got stuck in this particular role being refugees. So how can you deal with this as somebody who's planning or intending to take interviews in a Polish context? And then also I will ask you to answer this question in Luxembourg context.
Well, I think that in a way we are, our situation in Poland as researchers planning to do this, to conduct these interviews, is easier and more difficult at the same time. Well, it's easier because we are in a safe position. There's no war in Poland. We might feel affected by the war psychologically or politically, but we don't have this war in our country. So we have this safe position of doing the research. Which also means that we might feel more obliged to do this research because we are safe and we are not. And also, I think it means that it's a bit more complicated because people are bringing their experience of war, because we have refugees from Bucha, Mariupol, and so on in Poland. And after that, they have this experience of becoming a refugee, which, well, might be as difficult as having the experience of living in a country affected by the war in Ukraine. So we will need to combine these two experiences in one research. And also there's a bunch of ethical issues to solve. Who is going to conduct these interviews? I mean, mainly citizens of Poland, they should be skilled, they should be fluent in Russian or Ukrainian, Russian and Ukrainian. They should be sensitive enough to bear this responsibility of making no harm, because that's the basic principle. So somehow it's also more difficult and there's more responsibility, but also I think that we have this, I was talking about this obligation and responsibility, but also I think that there is this chance to bring the stories and the voices of the refugees to the Polish society in a more professional way than it's done now by the journalists. I mean, it's of course normal and needed that we are told the stories by the journalists now in Poland, but in a way, I think that there's time to have another type of stories heard, and it's our role, and I hope it's going to happen with no harm and as professional as possible.
Yes, so you can want to do something, and then there is a way how to do it. And when you're working in the place where I live, or I think in another place in the European Union, you're faced with a lot of like rules you need to obey to before doing such research is possible. And that takes a while. And this is why both in Poland and in Luxembourg, we will only be able to start actually to do the interviews now in June, and for us probably in July. But nevertheless, I have to say that there is this data protection, there is ethics commissioning, there is applying for funds, there is all of it. But I have a very good feeling of the people I could work with, because especially in March, in a way, these people have filled agendas already, but they really prioritize this over their other works. And I had teleconversations at 7:30 in the morning just because they had a full day ahead, but they wanted really to take care of this. And they've been trying to also bend the rules to such an extent that we could go forward as soon as possible, which now already still leaves us with some signatures we need to take care of down the road. But I rather had the feeling that yeah, my feeling of we can do something was shared by the people I needed to contact in order to make this happen. And it's the same for funding in a way. Normally this funding scheme is very strict and rigid and organized, but it was made available in a way for us, like temporary support funding, and we could apply for it and we received it. So I think in a way things were made possible. You can always complain about the fact that it's longer or later than you think, but we're 3 months further, and there is the money, there are all the most signatures we need, and we can actually go ahead. So I wouldn't complain too much.
Yeah, that's usually what Germans do. I was thinking, like, when I look at what you do, Sofia, in Lviv, then my first observation would be that you are able to do it because you created a communal way of doing business before, long time before, actually from the very beginning. And I have to say that I'm, like, before the war, and like before the war, even in 2014 when it actually started, and also afterwards, and now I have to say that I look at the Lviv Center as like a laboratory of doing it slightly differently, and I have to say that I'm a bit jealous because it seems to be utterly impossible to do it in a similar way in different settings. And maybe like one issue I already addressed, like this communal approach, that you look at it as a community. Second thing is you are doing it in an academically informed way, paying attention to a lot of issues which we discussed today, and which came also out in what we already discussed, that the way how you conduct interviews should be informed, consensual, sensitive. You have a psychologist involved, so you stick to academic standards, but at the same time you are not an academic institution in a strict sense as we have it usually put, that it is a why, because we usually tend to see academia and academic work and knowledge production as not only as a privilege but as a monopoly of the state, basically. And there's a lot of discussions now how to involve citizens and citizen science and this and that. And I think that you have done this, you have been doing this for 2 decades now. So maybe you could share your secret beyond these 2 points. No, I'm really, what you need in order to react to reality, actually, beyond this idea of that you are part of the communal urban social setting and you are responsible for it, and you are at the same time an academic actor and seeing yourself as a civic institution.
Yeah, so you know, so from where to start? I think there is this combination. There is a combination of different things. So you already said that we have a bit of research, a bit of public, a bit of digital, and a bit of educational. And I think that, combining is a good. It has its risks, it's not like the best formula. And I think it's also another part is a deficit, that it's like awareness, not only having limits, but also being aware of limits. I think that puts you as an institution, and it's a new institution. It's not very new. It's almost since 20 years old, but it's how you operate on different levels and understanding or navigating different hierarchies. Put it this way, because if you think about academia is about hierarchies. And if you think about, digital education, and actually how you place yourself. And I think that one of the ways for the Center for Urban History was to be on the intersection, like intersection of several areas of type, not only like disciplines, but of type of activities, which kind of does not necessarily put you on the hierarchy ladder, because you create a kind of your own blend of coordinates. And I think that the crucial part of that, and I think that was in our public history, is actually get connected, not only professionally, but get connected communally, with the place where we are not only researchers or professionals or experts, but where we are inhabitants and citizens, where we are living. Because we as human beings are complex. We have we have different parts to ourselves, and this combination of your, academic and community, it does create a good linkage. It's not necessarily always comfortable, always possible. It also, has its limits. And I think that as any hybrid format, it's a hybrid format of institution, but you actually have to improvise a bit. And there are a number of, of what you have as a possibility and limits that you can work with. And I think that, it's about seeing, you can't always do that. You want that you see the limit or the problem as a possibility. For example, you do have a problem of weak institutions. That's a problem, for example, academic and cultural, but then you actually can see, and it doesn't stop to be a problem, but you can also think that it pushes to cooperate across the fields. It does, you just need it, not because it is written in some book that it's a good thing to be interdisciplinary or cross-sectoral. It's just something that you really need. You don't have to push yourself. You really feel it. I mean, it doesn't mean that everybody feels and needs that, but this is actually, you have to. And I think that this is, this can be also the question of size. We are a fairly small institution. And I think that that's also creates like a communication inside that you can do quickly. You can not only react, you can discuss it and check and cross-discuss, and then maybe make a decision that most of us, and hopefully all of us, can live as a consequence, because with each decision, whether this decision, like documenting comes consequences, because you have to do that and then involve other people, and then there are lots of other that will come. So I don't know whether it's an answer, but it was at least my attempt to ask you to your question.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I would like to take this question further to Natalia, asking about the historical experience, but maybe also about your own experience as historians, as those who deal, who choose anyhow by themselves to a certain extent to do something and to relate themselves to a violent past, while they themselves are in a certain way not even migrants, but rather nomads, in the sense that they are in a way travelers who do not know where the path will lead them, and are not very protected in certain configurations, and have to change institutions to make their way. I mean, I ask you because you are in a transition now to Florida, which sounds great for us, while there's rain in Warsaw. But like, what is the level of security you need yourself as a historian? Like, looking at some of your heroes and some of the persons we know from the post-war history, also, in order to be able to conduct something, to get something done. Like, I'm still thinking about Szymon Datner and his transition from Białystok to Warsaw. What was a great thing, a great step.
Thank you. But I want to say something, if I'm allowed, also following up Sofia's comment, and because I'm struck by what you observed, this communal existence of a place that then becomes an address for people to maybe bring a diary or to give a testimony. And I remember again from the protocols of the Central Jewish Historical Commission, how on the one hand they had it's really well operating machinery given the immediate post-war months and years in the context of violence and civil war and complete displacement of everyone. It's not just whether you survive or not, but people change addresses and they start in one location and then they move and they move again and they move again. But both those that interview and those that give the interview, everybody, and the typist and literally everybody in the room. But there was a discussion at some point when they say, maybe we should connect between being given material assistance, like coming from especially American Jews, shoes and clothes and cans to testimony. You want the shoes? We need your story, and I keep on thinking about it in the context of the center. I'm not at all suggesting anything. I think it's quite the opposite. That that there is an interesting power relation between those of us who want those stories and understand the importance of the stories and want the stories from every angle, and not just two stories from women, but from young women and older women, and people who are the source of these stories, and how much, Anya, you talked about it as well, right? How much do we have the moral, the right to impose that desire for their insights? And we're right, of course, those that should be recorded, but how much can we be initiating this? Now, as to the question of transient nature, I'm even more thinking actually of Philip Friedman in this context, and Datner is also a wonderful example, but all of those men and women, actually, Rachela Auerbach and Josef Kermisch, they all are just as displaced multiple times as their subjects, as those that they collect the stories from. And this is a question that again goes to the question of academic structures and formal regulations and rules. I think it's in flux between the insecurity of many of these people that were involved in early collection of testimonies. None of them, I think, now quickly made a sort of wonderful, stable career. And yet they were doing this incredible collecting mission. And then there was a degree of misunderstanding in all kinds of places where they ended up. In Poland, that became less and less open to hearing the stories, and abroad. And in Israel as well, where Yad Vashem is a state institution, and yet there is a great deal of tension with hearing the voices of survivors from Eastern Europe. So I think there is not one model, but there is certainly a sense of how much there is to look sort of as in the mirror at the biographies and struggles of people who were not only giving testimonies, but also asking for testimonies. And by the way, many of those who asked for testimonies didn't leave their own. Something I don't know, Sofia, if you're writing a diary, but it's a question how much we're part of that process that we build.
I think in a way, if not directly, but indirectly, these things are connected, because you think about now, it's the people are much more aware of the importance of their voice. And I think that this is what has to be argued much more in earlier. We are in a way in depth to people who did that generations, and then to people who thought about why oral history matters, why history from below matters, why different voices, experiences matter. And I think that it's not only a part of academic discussion, it's a part of popular culture, it's a part of the culture in which we operate. And I think it really does create a much, we are operating in a different setting, all of us, much more valuing, and, when one can the experience of individual. And I think that individual doesn't have to be, a very privileged one. So it's, and I think that this, in a way, yeah, we are in depth in a multiple and sometimes not very direct, but still connected way to what was happening in the way we understand the past and the way we also see ourselves, the present, to people who did it before.
So thank you so much. As we started already in the very morning, we decided to keep this discussion compact, but instead invite to continue it right after. I think that's important that even if I think we managed to explain that we do it now, and also why it is important that it is done now. And we address some of the issues, how to do it, or at least what to pay attention to. Then still, I think it's important to make sure that we are talking about documenting the ongoing war. So it's not about doing research. It's not about synthesizing, getting through, working through, creating future narratives. We are not at this stage, and that's not the purpose of what we address today. We are still very much thinking of how to collect material future research can base on. So this also means that the question of our responsibility of, in the end, still being historians to some extent, vis-a-vis the people we ask to give their voice, is still an open question, and we will have to answer this question only once we got through the material in the future, hopefully in the near future when the war will be over. And I think that this means that the way how we do carry out this last phase of then already research, and the way how we communicate our research results, the way how we think about the voices being represented there, but also the question of translation, of language, of giving our insights, our thoughts back. I think that's something still we will discuss only in the future, and then hopefully in the near future. And I really wish you that you can change the title very soon of the ongoing project work. Thank you all four of you for this introduction, for this discussion, which was in fact only an introduction to a longer conversation. Thank you everybody who was here in the room and also online following our discussion. The Zapis, the recording will be made available through the Lviv Center of Urban History in the frame of a lecture series which just started today. So thank you everybody in the room, and have a good weekend, and may the war be over very soon.